As I announced at the 9 o'clock service, this is the last Sunday for the fall semester of Sunday school, so we won't be able to finish the book of Ruth, which is, I kind of wanted to finish it before the end of fall, but that actually good news is because that means that the final exam is delayed until January, so you have extra time to study for it. Yeah, well, it's multiple choice and essay, so. So I just want to say one word about the end of chapter 2, and then we'll take a look at chapter 3, which is the penultimate chapter in this 4-chapter book. So remember last time we saw Boaz as an example of Hesed. He is not only willing to allow Ruth to glean, but he's actually willing to supply her with water. He invites her to a meal. He allows her to take far more than she really had any right to have. And so, in this sense, right, Boaz is a sort of an example, and one might even say a conduit of the Hesed of God. Now, we'll come back to this later, but I just want to kind of make one point here about Hesed among human beings, because I think it's an important point. We'll come back to it when we take a look at chapter 4, but for now I think we can say this, right? That Hesed among human beings kind of requires like two basic things. It requires more than that, but just two really fundamental things. First, thing number one, right, is the practice of Hesed among human beings requires a certain understanding of who God is, right? If God is the ultimate practitioner of Hesed, and God sort of like defines the nature of reality, that means that the practice of Hesed is part of the nature of reality. Makes sense, right? So how human beings practice Hesed, this kind of faithful covenant love and generosity, is dependent upon how they understand God. And the other thing that's at work here in the practice of Hesed, and this is important too, right? The practice of Hesed also presupposes that we see that we have obligations amongst ourselves as creatures of God. So here's one way to think about this, right? Notice that what we often call the second tablet of the law, that part of the Ten Commandments that deals with interhuman relationships. Notice, right, that's kind of a way of saying, you know what? There are fundamental obligations among people that cannot be overlooked, right? You shall not commit adultery. So the obligation of husband and wife, right, that's a fundamental obligation that cannot be set aside. You shall honor your father and mother. That is, there's a fundamental obligation between the generations that can't be set aside. You shall not murder. There's a fundamental obligation not to unjustly take the life of somebody else simply because that's what you want to do or because they're in your way. There are like fundamental obligations that exist among people because they are creatures of God. So that's the other thing. So in Boaz, we see both. In Boaz, we see someone who recognizes that God himself is like the ultimate practitioner of Hesed. And we also see in him someone who is cognizant and aware of the obligations that exist among people. And that's why Boaz behaves the way he does, both to Naomi and also to Ruth. Right, obviously, right, this could be a very different story where, Ruth and Naomi come to Boaz and they're kind of wanting his help, and Boaz kind of looks at him and says, oh no, somebody else who wants something from me. This is a very different story, right? Because Boaz recognizes those obligations. And with that in mind, something about Boaz is said right at the end of chapter 2 that I think is really important. We touched on it yesterday or last night, but I want to come back to it again. This is something that Naomi says to Ruth in 2:20 and following. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. One of our redeemers. It is, there's something else that's going on here that's really important. Boaz is also being sort of set up here as an icon, an image of what a redeemer is. And obviously this is looking forward now to the New Testament, right? Where we're going to get the ultimate redeemer, right? Christ. So the idea right here is that by looking at Boaz, we should sort of get an idea of the character of what's going on in a redeemer. And we learn some really important things. Two things I think that are really important for us right now, right? A redeemer is someone who removes someone else from a situation of danger or disadvantage, okay? Whether that means that, you're buying someone out of slavery, which is the original name of redeemer in the book of Leviticus, whether you are helping someone, like a family member, like out of poverty, or out of some sort of servitude or extreme level of debt, right? It means, right, that you are exercising some of your own resources to help someone else who is incapable of helping themselves. And that's what we see exactly in Boaz, right? Once again, right? Notice here that the motive for redemption is both a sort of driving sense of compassion and, of course, to use that wonderful word again, hesed. Okay? So we just want to remember, right, as we're looking forward to the New Testament, right, we want to remember, right, Jesus' fundamental and overwhelming motive for all that he does is, and this should sound familiar, his absolute love of God and his absolute love of human beings. That's the motive that drives everything that he does. Okay? So, right, the thing that we're not going to see, the thing that we don't see as Jesus goes to the cross, for example, is, Jesus being, hauled away out of the Garden of Gethsemane by the temple police, being taken to Pilate. And, as he's pulled out of the garden, he's overheard to say, well, I hope you guys appreciate what I'm doing for you. No. But as noticed here, right, one of the things that all the crucifixion accounts make very clear, right, in their different ways, is Jesus basically doesn't respond at all to what happens. He doesn't try to escape. He doesn't, tell the Roman guards as they're about to, put the crown of thorns on him, hey, don't you realize I'm the Son of God, and if you do this, I'm going to, destroy this whole place, None of that. And the idea right here is that his motive for doing what he does is simultaneously his complete love of God and his complete love of human beings. That's the character of a Redeemer. And we're getting a glimpse of that in the person of Boaz. So to put it in a kind of strong way, Boaz here is in some ways a kind of a prefiguration of Christ in some ways. And I think he's meant to be that way in the book. So let's take a look at chapter 3. So the drama is now kind of coming to its conclusion or its high point in 3. We're going to see what happens, and so we'll just pick the story up right at Ruth 3:1. And here's what happens. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, Ruth, my daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you work? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she replied, all that you say, I will do. So that's how the story opens. So here we have this interesting scene here where Naomi uses a really important word. And I just want to spend a little bit of time thinking about it. Naomi says, then Naomi said to her, her mother said to her daughter-in-law, my daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may go well with this word rest is really important. It's a really important Old Testament word, so I want to spend some time thinking about it. Remember that the first place that we encounter this really important word, right, is in the first chapter of the book of Genesis, where the Sabbath is set aside as a day of rest. Rest here meaning not just simply not working, although that's certainly part of it, right? Rest in a kind of more broader, or a larger sense, right? That is, the people of Israel are called to practice this day of rest, not just as a kind of way of like, recharging for the next day's work, right? But something more fundamental. That is, and it's really important for us to remember, right? As far as we know, the people of Israel were the only people in the ancient world who practiced this. Okay, so throughout all the ancient world, right? The work week is 7 days a week, sun up to sundown. The people of Israel are like weird because there's this one day where they don't work. And it's a way of saying, look, there's more going on in the world than human labor. If you don't work on one day, the whole world's not going to fall apart. Because why? Because there is a generous and good creator behind this whole thing. And your ceasing labor on this one day is your act of faith that that's actually the case. Notice here, right? And for some of us who are maybe have like workaholic tendencies, right? The idea of a day of rest is kind of threatening. What? No work? What am I going to do? This is especially true of people who like go on vacation and are like sitting out by the pool and they've got like their laptop and their phone and they're emailing the office and all that kind of stuff. So rest here is more than just like not working. Rest here is, in effect, entering into a situation of peace, security, and provision. The other place, of course, where rest becomes very important is, remember, God gives the people of Israel the land of Canaan and intends that they find rest in the land, right? And then, of course, later on we'll come and we'll see the letter to the Hebrews will remind us, right, that actually the Sabbath itself was simply pointing toward Christ, in whom we find the rest, capital R. That is, the Sabbath itself was actually pointing to Christ, right? And that reminds us of that story. Remember where the disciples are going through the grain field and they pluck some, they pluck some of the grain and eat it. It's the early version of the granola bar. They're eating this grain, and the Pharisees somehow see it and are upset. Your disciples are working the Sabbath. This is wrong. This just shows what a crummy teacher you are, and blah blah blah. You haven't taught them properly. And in my day, we never worked on the Sabbath, and da 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 da. And that led to stories about we walked to synagogue, 7 miles in the snow, uphill both ways, and all that kind of stuff. And that's when Jesus says, remember what Jesus tells them. He says, well, that's true. You shouldn't work on the Sabbath. But then he says this, remember, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. That is, the Sabbath wasn't made for me. I'm in charge of the Sabbath. I'm like the Sabbath in person. That's what he says. So what Naomi wants for Ruth is for her to enter into this kind of situation of rest, security, peace, provision, and that's why she's doing what she does. So then we have this odd scene, and it is kind of odd, right? Where what Ruth is supposed to do is she's supposed to go out to the threshing floor. We're in the middle of the barley harvest, and what they would normally do is they would do the threshing at evening when the wind picked up, right? And so you're threshing your barley, and so everybody's kind of working, and it's just kind of this interesting communal scene where everybody's got this job and they're all doing stuff, and so at the end of the threshing, right, they're not gonna check into a hotel for the night. They're actually gonna sleep on the threshing floor. That's what's gonna happen. And so the idea here is that when everyone does this, Ruth is supposed to go and lay down at the feet of Boaz and kind of like uncover his feet, like pull the blanket aside and then lay down. And then she's told, wait, and then he'll tell you what to do. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't like instructions like that. I don't like instructions that involve, well, go here, stand there, and then wait and see what happens. That's not appealing to me. I don't imagine it's appealing to Ruth either, but notice what's going on here. Two things that are important. And I want to point out to a passage from Ezekiel. One is sort of like a little cultural note, right? The cultural note here is that Ruth is to do this as a way of letting Boaz know that she is entertaining the idea of marriage. She's presenting herself to him as a bride. And of course, we just want to think right here that we just want to remember, right, one of the things that's going on here, right, and that is the overarching image of, in the Old Testament, right, remember, the ultimate groom in the Old Testament is God, and the ultimate bride in the Old Testament is the people of Israel. So something's going on here that transcends Boaz and Ruth. So that's one thing. The other thing here, of course, right, is notice here that the faith that's being placed in Boaz doing the right thing. That is in effect, right? This is, I like to see this almost as sort of like an image or an echo of, remember in the second chapter of John, in the miracle at the wedding in Cana of Galilee. Remember Mary, mother of Jesus, hears that they've run out of wine, huge social crisis. The caterers were supposed to bring 12 cases of champagne. They only brought one, and we've run out. Huge embarrassment. Mary tells Jesus. Jesus doesn't seem to be interested in doing anything. And that's when Mary says to the servants, do whatever he tells you. It's an act of faith, right? Do whatever he tells you. Whatever that is. I don't know what he's going to tell you. But I believe that whatever he tells you will be like the right thing. And so that's kind of what's happening here with Boaz, right? Both Naomi and Ruth are, in effect, depending upon the fact that Boaz is actually a genuine practitioner of Hesed and can be counted on to do like the right thing. And of course, that act of faith actually turns out to be correct. So here's how the story continues in 3:6. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet, and he said, "Who are you?" A natural question, right? And she answered him, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. And then this is what Boaz says. And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear, for I will do all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then, as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." So two things here that we just want to kind of think about. Once again, on the surface, right, this is kind of an interesting story, but there's a lot going on beneath the surface that we want to identify. One thing that's really important to point out, notice here what Boaz says to Ruth. Now remember, right, Ruth is a Moabite, boo hiss, boo hiss. She's a Gentile, boo hiss, boo hiss. And she's kind of like a stranger, in Israel, boo hiss, boo hiss. Notice what Boaz says to her. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. You are a worthy woman. That is, you may be a Gentile. There may be like bad thoughts about your people here amongst the people of Israel. There may be like negative sentiments about you around here. But I recognize that you are a worthy woman. Why? Because you have shown faithfulness and hesed to your mother-in-law, Naomi. And you have planted yourself here among my people, and you are seeking to enter into a relationship with my God. You are a worthy woman. That's kind of like a revelation. Now, another thing that's going on here, and here's where, having a kind of a knowledge of the Old Testament can really be helpful. I want to read to you a passage from Ezekiel 16, which I think helps us understand what's going on here. This passage actually concerns God's relationship with Israel. It's actually quite long, but I'm just going to kind of pull out a little piece of it. And what we have here is in Ezekiel 16, God is speaking to the people of Israel. And he's telling them how he came across them. That is, they were sort of like a defenseless outcast. And God has like taken them in. He's covered them with his wings, hint, hint, hint. And he has taken Israel to himself as his spouse. That's the general burden of Ezekiel 16. But here's the part that I want to read you. This is Ezekiel 16:8 and following. He's talking here about Israel, but kind of lying defenseless and like vulnerable, and then says this: when I passed by you again and saw you, behold, you were at the age for love, and I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your nakedness. I made a vow to you and entered into a covenant with you, declares the Lord God, and you became mine. Then I bathed you with water and washed off the blood from you and anointed you with oil, hints of the Good Samaritan, right? The guy who finds the guy that's beaten up outside the road, bathes him, anoints him with oil, takes him to the end, that kind of thing. I clothed you with embroidered cloth and shod you with fine leather. I wrapped you in fine linen and covered you with silk. And I adorned you with ornaments and put bracelets on your wrists and a chain on your neck, and I put a ring in your nose and earrings in your ears and a beautiful crown on your head. Thus you were adorned with gold and silver, and your clothing was of fine linen and silk and embroidered cloth. You ate fine flour and honey and oil. You grew exceedingly beautiful and advanced to royalty. Notice what God's telling the people of Israel. He's telling them, right? Everything that you have, your current status, whatever righteousness you have, your dignity, your kind of place in the world, royalty, things like that, everything that you have has been given to you by me. And I gave it to you gladly, right? That is, this is a call for the people of Israel to acknowledge the kind of relationship they have with God. God who practices hesed toward the undeserving. In Boaz's action toward Ruth, we're seeing an echo of that hesed. We're seeing an echo of the kind of relationship that God has with his people. So when we have negative thoughts, right, about, Gentiles and how awful they are and, da-da-da-da-da, the reminder's going to come back. Oh, wait a minute. To use the question that Paul poses in Romans, right? What do you have that was not given to you? What do you have that was not given to you? In a sense, right, whether you're Jewish or whether you're Gentile, right, the answer to that question is going to be the same thing. Whatever you have was given to you by a God who practices Hesed. And that's what we're seeing here in the person of Boaz. And then Boaz does something else, which I think is really interesting. And this will be where we have to conclude. So notice here, just as God made a covenant with the people of Israel, Boaz makes a covenant with Ruth. And the covenant is this: yes, I acknowledge that I'm a redeemer. I also know that there's someone who's closer to you who can fulfill that role. If he doesn't, I promise to you that I will. If he doesn't do it, I will. That's my promise to you. And then this. And he said, bring the garment you were wearing and hold it out. And so she held it out, and he measured 6 measures of barley and put it on her. And then she went into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did you fare, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. That is, what Boaz does here is he kind of offers to Ruth a kind of a token of his genuineness by basically kind of giving her what would amount to, probably like 2 or 3 weeks of food, like all at once. We're in the barley harvest. Hold out your garment, and I'm going to fill it up, and you're going to take this home. And so Ruth comes home basically with, like 6 shopping carts from Publix, all filled up. And this is a sign that he actually does intend to keep this promise. And I think this is a really important turning point for Naomi, who now recognizes, right, that her earlier statement about God is not correct. Remember, she earlier said back in chapter 1 that God had simply afflicted and abandoned her. She now knows that that's not true. God has not abandoned her, and that big full garment full of barley is sort of like the sacramental sign that that's not the case, that God's actually very much with her. Well, in January, we'll see how this story concludes. And I promise that as Jim said, the final exam will be multiple choice, and so it shouldn't be too difficult.